So Ricardo asked me to speak about knowledge acquisition in the long run. And so this is not since the origin of the Federal Reserve, but as Ricardo said, 65 or even 100,000 years. So everybody knows about the Great Divergence, the growth in Europe and North America in the last several hundred years. And on Ricardo's account, this is driven by the acquisition of knowledge. But this is really the second Great Divergence, at least. The first Great Divergence happened sometime in the last few 100,000 years when the human species diverged from other animals. And so what I want to convince you of today is that that divergence is driven by the same factors. It's driven by the cultural accumulation of knowledge, productive knowledge, in populations. So to start with, let me start with what most other animals are like. So most other animals, so I've picked the primates here, the other apes, have limited ranges. Piece of a continent, usually a particular habitat, maybe a couple of habitats. Humans are radically different. The human habitat is the entire globe, and we're the only organism, literally the only organism that has a range that extends across the entire globe. The only exceptions being our parasites and pests. And who hitchhike along with our ability to adapt to a very wide range of environments. What's more, we did this extremely fast. So 60,000 years ago, we know from genetic data that modern humans left Africa and moved first into Southwest Asia. And then in the next 10 or 20,000 years, they spread to every part of the old world. And by 12,000 years ago, they spread to the New World. So now look at that map. Those colors on the map are the range of habitats. This is a reconstruction of the habitat 60,000 years ago when people moved across the world. The people who left Africa were tropical foragers. They lived in the Horn of Africa. They were probably coastal foragers. And in 10,000 years, they spread entirely across the southern coast of Asia. Something that got to Australia, something that no other mammal had done in 65 million years, no other placental mammal. Moved north into the northern cold parts of Asia, completely different habitats, completely different problems to solve, completely different ways of life. So by 30,000 years ago, amazingly, there's a site here at 73 degrees north where the Yana River flows into the Arctic Ocean. And a tropical forager had transformed itself, a population of tropical foragers, into a creature that could live north of the Arctic Circle, a completely different habitat. What this tells us is that humans are really good at adapting to different environments, much better than other organisms. We're more able to rapidly adapt to different environments than other organisms. So how do we do this? So I'm in an audience mainly of economists, I guess, here, and you won't be surprised. Your first guess would probably be, well, we're just smarter than those other organisms. We figure stuff out. And this is a very common explanation both in economics, to the extent that economists worry about these problems, but certainly all through the social sciences. We're smarter than the average bear, as my childhood hero used to say. And I want to convince you that that's not right. Humans are smart, although measuring intelligence across species is notoriously difficult. But it does seem likely that we have cognitive skills that make us better at adapting to a range of environments than most other organisms. But we're not nearly smart enough to solve the range of problems that you have to solve to make that march from the Horn of Africa to the Yana River. And so to convince you of that, I want to ask you to participate in a thought experiment. The thought experiment is, I take a population of people, let's suppose these are more intelligent than average people, the residents of this room, and I maroon you north of the Arctic Circle in a habitat similar to the habitat that those Yana River people lived in. I give you 6 months of supplies, and I ask you to figure out how to live there. Now, maybe you think this is a ridiculous question, but it's not, because this is exactly the way other organisms adapt to environments. With very few exceptions, other animals cannot learn from each other. Each individual comes into the world with a genetic endowment and then has to figure things out for itself. There are a few species, like chimps here, that can learn a little bit from each other, but there's no known case in which a species learns something from other individuals in its population that it couldn't and doesn't learn on its own. Okay, so there you are. You're on the Arctic beach. Let's go through a quick sampler of the things you have to invent in order to live there. And like Ricardo, I'm going to focus on the Inuit of the north coast of North America, because they give us the best picture of what hunter-gatherer societies living in the Arctic are like. So the first thing you're going to have to do is invent warm clothing. Winter temperatures average, daily average temperatures are like -25. You're going to die much below zero for sure. You need warm clothes. You need to figure out where to get the fabric. You need to figure out it's going to be furs. You need to figure out which animal. You need to figure out when to harvest them. You need to figure out how to tan the hides, where to get the thread to sew them together, how to cut the clothes, on and on and on. Sendil thought it was hard to figure out whether to rent or buy his car. This is already a much harder problem. Okay? And you've got lots more problems to solve. So the clothes aren't going to keep you alive in the winter storms. You need a house. Igloo is the word for house in Inuit. So you need a house made out of snow in some habitats, other things. And you're going to have to figure out a source of heat and light. There's no wood. You need to melt snow in the wintertime to get water, because there's no running water in a lot of places. How are you going to do that? Hard problem. You need to hunt. The only wood available to make bows is crummy driftwood spruce that flows out the Mackenzie River. You have to figure out how to make a powerful bow, big enough to throw a heavy arrow hard enough to kill a caribou. And it just goes on and on and on. Toggle harpoons, sunglasses, these fancy spears called leisters, and then the king of Inuit adaptations, the kayak, a fantastically complicated, amazingly well-engineered boat for, in this case, harvesting marine mammals on the north coast of North America. Okay, so what do you think your chances are? I don't like your chances. These are really hard problems, and there's a ton, and I've only talked about the stuff, let alone all the ecological knowledge you're going to have to come up with and so on. You're a bunch of smart people, but there's no chance, I think, that you would solve this problem. And, of course, thought experiments are nice, but real experiments are better. And the reason I'm certain of this is this experiment has been run many times in the last couple hundred years. I call it the Lost European Explorer experiment. So what usually happens is some European goes off with good or bad motives, depends, and gets lost, things go wrong, runs out of food, and either dies or suffers terribly. So a good example is Sir John Franklin. Sir John Franklin left England in about 1845. He spent, he and 150 sailors, 2 ships, the best equipped British Arctic expedition. He was also a fellow of the Royal Society, which cuts a lot of ice in my world. And he disappeared and was never seen again. It was a cause célèbre. Multiple rescue expeditions, never found. We now know what happened to John Franklin because archaeologists have found the remains of his expedition. His ships were icebound the winter of 1845 near Beechey Island, which is near Baffin Island. The winter of 1846, they were icebound near King William Island, and they ran out of food. They tried to make it overland to Hudson's Bay posts in the south. They all starved to death. Now, here's the thing. Beechey Island is the homeland of a very well-studied group of Inuit, the Netsilik, and they've been living there for at least 700 years, raising their kids, no boats, no guns, none of the stuff that, no FRSs either, and they were doing fine. In fact, the main harbor on Beechey Island, where the British starved, the word in Inuit means lots of fat. So the British sailors and the Inuit were biologically the same, essentially, equally smart, had the same cognitive capacities. The British starved and the Inuit lived because the Inuit were heir to a pool of culturally accumulated knowledge about how to make things, where to hunt, how the ecology worked, and so on, that the British weren't. So it's not their ability to solve problems as individuals that's the key. It's the ability to solve problems as populations that are the key. So nobody invents a kayak. That's still harder than figuring out whether to lease or buy. And what happens is populations of people learn how to make kayaks gradually over time. People make small improvements. Those improvements are transmitted. They spread, the good ones. And then somebody else makes a small improvement, and so on. So Newton famously said that if he stood farther, it was because if he saw farther, it was because he stood on the shoulders of giants. I think the real story for almost all human populations at almost all times is that innovators stand on top of a vast pyramid of midgets, each of whom have made a small contribution. And people learn this in exactly the way that Ricardo described earlier, by apprenticeship in small-scale societies where there is none of this schooling. Nonetheless, people can create highly adaptive, very complex bits of technology, of which the kayak is an example. So complex that Freeman Dyson's son, George Dyson, spent his early years trying to figure out the engineering and marine architecture of kayaks, lots of Navier-Stokes equations and stuff, and failed. Okay, so the thing that made people able to explode across the world 60,000 years ago is that sometime soon before that, we evolved the capacity to learn from each other in a way that allowed the accumulation of knowledge in populations through time, an adaptation that other animals don't have. So what I'd like to do now is give you a couple of empirical examples that suggest that how this works itself out in time, that it's populations, not individuals. So the first one has to do with cultural devolution. So when people spread across the Pacific, they lost quite a bit of technology, pottery, bows and arrows, other things. And one way to think about this is to think about it in population dynamic terms. In small populations, information gets lost by random chance. The guy who knows how to make a kayak or how to make do pottery in a particular group, he's just populated an island, he dies before he gets to transmit, or he's just a jerk and nobody wants to hang around with him, or something like that, and the skills are lost or degraded. Somebody else figures out how to improve things, and the skills that the population have are improved. So there's going to be a balance between gain and loss, and that balance should be affected by population size. So bigger populations should be able to maintain a larger pool of cultural information. So my student and I, this is what all major professors do, she did all the work and I take the credit. This is Michelle Klein. We collected data on marine foraging technology in a series of islands across the Pacific. And here's the data. And you can see that the horizontal axis is the logarithm of population size. The vertical axis is the log of number of tools. These are marine foraging tools. You can see there's a quite strong positive relationship. And the islands that are close to others, that are high contact islands, the blue ones, political symbolism is intentional, the low contact islands are generally below the line. The high contact islands are above the line. So this is an example of how it's not the individuals themselves that invent the tools. It's the population, and you can work out the consequences of that. In this case, the rates of gain and loss is a function of population size, and you can then go to data and check. How much time do I have? I can't read that, sorry.
1 minute.
1 minute, great, perfect. Okay, let me finish up by echoing Ricardo's idea about how the people have to move, not the ideas. And this is data from the spread of agriculture in Europe. So the red points here are places where DNA has been collected from ancient skeletons of hunter-gatherers in northern Europe before agriculture arrived. And they're all red because they all have a particular mitochondrial genotype, the U haplotype. And now this is data from Europe after agriculture had spread. So these lines, agriculture started down here about 10,000 years ago, and it spread gradually across Europe, reaching Denmark and England about 6,000 years ago. The yellow dots are a different mitochondrial genotype, and you can see that most of the and these are from skeletons dug up from that period. So these are we know the genotype of the people who lived there 7,000 years ago, and it was different than the hunter-gatherers there before. There's a ton of genetic data that support this idea that it wasn't the idea and the knowledge about how to farm that diffused across Europe. It was the farmers who diffused across Europe. And even though it took 6,000 years, and that's obviously due to the limitations of demographics. Humans have low birth rates, population growth is low, so it takes a long time for the people to diffuse across Europe. You would think that this great idea of farming would diffuse way ahead of it, but it didn't. And my conjecture is it didn't for exactly the same reasons that Ricardo mentioned in his talk. It's hard to learn. There's a bunch of complicated skills that have to fit together. And as a consequence, farming population spread, not farmers. So with that, I think I made my time, and I will turn it over to the next speaker. Thanks very much.